Growing up, I always thought my Uncle Jack was the coolest guy in the world. He was my mom's younger brother by 4 years, and while my dad was a straight-laced police detective working in Santa Monica, Uncle Jack ran a surf shop down on the beach. He wasn't some loser, far from it. That surf shop was a legit business with half a dozen employees and a six-figure annual turnover. But even so, my dad always seemed to look at Jack like he was some rebel kid brother, even if he loved him to death. Jack had a beach house right on the shore, and every summer we'd drive out there to hang with him and his girlfriend, Naomi. One summer, we packed everything up, eager to head down for some fun in the sun. But then my dad suddenly told us Uncle Jack was busy and we'd have to wait for another time. We could still go to the beach, just not to Jack's place. I remember feeling pretty disappointed in the moment, but I guess I forgot about it almost instantly the second my toes hit the sand. I was only 7, so I was still pretty innocent, and that sudden change of plans didn't seem suspicious at all. What I did notice, though, was how strange Mom and Dad seemed to act, whispering quietly, casting secretive glances at each other. I was just a kid, playing in the sand, so I didn't question it. I was busy building castles and all that. But the very next day, Mom and Dad sat me and my little brother, Danny, down on the couch. Their faces looked serious, and they told us that Uncle Jack had been in a terrible car accident and had gone to be with the angels. They didn't go into all the gruesome details, but to lose Uncle Jack hit me hard. I was sad for a long time afterward. As with all sorrow of that kind, the grief gradually faded, and life moved forward. I grew up, graduated, got a job, and eventually moved up to Oxnard with a girl I'd been dating for a few years. One day we drove back to Santa Monica to visit my parents. We had dinner, caught up some, then headed back on the road to Oxnard. About halfway there, my girlfriend suddenly went quiet, all mopey, and I noticed she was tense. I asked if she was okay, and she just said, "Yeah, I get weirded out sometimes when we pass that part of the PCH." Curious, I asked her why, and she started telling me a story that chilled me. She explained that 20 years earlier, her mom's old high school friend, Lisa, went to stay in a log cabin with her boyfriend for the weekend. She told Lisa's mom where they were going, how long they'd be gone, and when she'd be back. When that date passed and she didn't come home, Lisa's mom grew worried. She contacted the police, told them where Lisa had been, who she was with, and asked them to check on her. A few days later, they found Lisa's boyfriend's car abandoned by the side of the road, wiped out intentionally, with the guy's body inside, dead from a broken neck. Her body wrapped in plastic and shoved into the trunk. They never figured out how or why Lisa had been killed, but they all suspected her boyfriend had done it, especially since authorities found his fingerprints all over the plastic. Lisa's mom was devastated. She'd met Lisa a few times, and she seemed like a really sweet girl. My girlfriend told me she'd get emotional whenever passing that stretch of highway, almost like it haunted her. She sighed and said, "Poor Lisa, such a terrible way to go." Hearing this, my stomach dropped. I asked her, "Wait a second, did you just say Lisa?" That's when two thoughts hit me like a ton of bricks. Uncle Jack had a girlfriend named Lisa, and he died in a car accident. But nobody had ever said anything about it being intentional. I asked her if she remembered her boyfriend's name, the guy who'd driven off the road, and I felt that wave of panic start rising in my chest. The only thing that kept me from losing it was that little voice inside my head telling me, "It's just a coincidence. You're confusing patterns. There are tons of people named Lisa and Joe." Stopped freaking out over nothing. But the moment my girlfriend said, "Yeah, I think it was Ron or Rick," something like that, that voice vanished. She then blurted, Yeah, it was Ron. Did you hear about this already?" I didn't answer right away. I just focused on the road, trying to keep my head together. When I finally managed to pull over, I told her to wait in the car and called my mom and dad from my cell phone. It was almost 9 p.m., so Dad was watching TV, and I could hear the concern in his voice as soon as he picked up. He could tell something was wrong by the way I was acting. I hesitated, then asked him, "Dad, how did Uncle Jack die?" He quickly answered, "You know it was a car accident, right?" I pressed further, asking if it was really just an accident or if something else had happened. Dad paused, clearly thinking, then said, "Come by the house tomorrow, I'll explain everything." That cast a weird numbness over me, and although my girlfriend kept pressing me for details, I couldn't find the words until we returned home. I had this irrational fear that if I didn't stay focused behind the wheel, I'd end up dead in a crash, like I was caught in some kind of horror film loop. But luckily, we made it back safely. I poured myself a beer, sat down with my girlfriend, and told her everything, including how my dad had all the answers but refused to give details that night. She kept apologizing, saying she felt responsible for telling me that story, but I reassured her it wasn't her fault. The blame was Uncle Jack's. That night I barely slept. When I finally dozed off, I was haunted by this vivid nightmare where my dad took me into the garage and showed me Uncle Jack's body. I woke up before I saw the coffin, but it was enough to make me splash cold water on my face in the bathroom to chase the shakes away. A few hours later, I was back on the highway heading to Santa Monica to see my parents again, expecting a confrontation emotionally. It was going to be rough. When I arrived, Mom was already crying, and her first words were a big apology for hiding the truth for so long. I had an idea, of course, but hearing the full story was still incredibly disturbing. Dad relayed what he knew, which was that Uncle Jack and Lisa had gone up to a cabin for the weekend, supposed to come back Monday morning. But then Dad heard from Jack that Monday afternoon sounded angry, ranting about something, but his words made no sense. He mentioned some incident at the cabin, but Dad couldn't get any details. Suddenly, Jack hung up. Dad said he thought he'd called from the road because he could hear traffic in the background. He tried calling back the next day, but Jack didn't answer. That was the same day we'd planned to visit Uncle Jack's. And then just half an hour before leaving, Dad saw a car parked out front. When he went outside, it was two detectives from the local police. They told him Uncle Jack had been found dead, but it wasn't an accident. It was murder. Dad wasn't working homicide, and even if he had, he said, he wouldn't have been on that case. Still, he got all the details from his cop friends. What they found was chilling. Uncle Jack's movements, traced to that cabin near Redwood Creek, a place that usually booked up almost year-round. But that weekend it was completely empty except for Jack and Lisa. All the other cabins in the area were free. No reservations, no bookings, just those two. The detectives questioned the owners, but they said they had no evidence of involvement. The puzzle deepened when authorities learned that just hours before the tragedy, Jack and Lisa had stopped at a gas station where the clerk remembered them acting normal as ever. Jack fueling up, Lisa buying a soda, no sign of trouble. But somehow, in that short drive, something violent had happened. Jack pulled over, the evidence suggests, and then something terrible, the murder weapon, was used. The detectives couldn't determine if Jack had murdered Lisa before or after that call to his dad. But shortly afterward, Jack drove himself off the road. The scene was suspicious, and I remember Dad telling me this story with a heavy voice. The first time I'd seen him shed tears. He looked angry, frustrated, and utterly helpless. It wasn't just grief. It was that helpless fury, that gnawing need to understand why. The unanswered questions haunted him, the cabins, Jack's state of mind, the caliber thing. When the police learned about that call, they zeroed in on what Jack had said. But all Dad could tell them was it made no sense, just random words. He tried to work out what Jack had been saying, concentrating so hard, yet it all just sounded like rambling. Then Dad told me he'd gotten a sinking feeling, realizing Jack had just lost it, that he'd gone completely crazy. Dad said he called Jack, told him to calm down, promised to call him back in a few hours to check on him. But Jack never picked up again. That's what broke Dad. I remember feeling numb after he finished. I shed some tears for him and Mom, seeing their pain, but honestly I'd been up all night, questioning everything, the guilt, the fear, the helplessness. I had processed it over and over, a roller coaster of grief. So by the time I heard the gruesome details, I was just resigned. Mom and Dad apologized many times for keeping this from me so long, saying it all had to happen that way. I told them I understood they couldn't have expected a kid to handle that kind of truth, and I appreciated them finally telling me. But none of that made it easier. All that emotional weight, bottled up for years, exploded now. I was wrecked internally. When I finally returned home, I told my girlfriend that Uncle Jack was probably the one who killed Lisa's friend. And as you might imagine, that was a huge conversation. We discussed it endlessly. That's really what helped me get through it, the fact that someone who truly cared about me was right there, listening and understanding. She never told her mom what she knew at that time, out of respect, and over the years, we drifted apart not because of that, but simply life circumstances. I still think about her, and how she helped me survive one of the hardest times of my life. I grew up in Manchester single-parent family, and it was always just me and my mom. I never knew differently. Sometimes I'd get sad thinking other girls had dads at home, but I loved my mom more than anything. As I got older, she'd tell me things about my dad, what he liked, what kind of guy he was, and then about how he died. I was still very young when she told me that he and his friends had been on a boat, caught in a storm, and that's how it all ended. She explained that the angels had taken him to heaven, which made me wonder years later, after watching cartoons like SpongeBob, whether heaven might actually be pretty cool. Kids say the funniest things, don't they? Mom told me that story early enough, so it didn't make me too sad, just part of how I grew up. But then came the day she told me the full truth, a day that changed everything. I already knew she'd tell me the good stuff, like he loved football, Chinese food, and that he'd worked construction since leaving school. But then she dropped a bomb. When I was about 23, she asked if I wanted to hear some truths about my dad, truths I might not like. I asked what she meant, and from her tone, I suspected it was darker stuff. She told me that after I was born, Dad went on a last holiday in Spain before I arrived, and he went out to sea with some friends. The weather turned bad and he got into serious trouble. She said he'd gone a little too far out, the sea rose up, and that was the end. But that was only part of it. She hadn't told me everything. When I pressed her, she revealed that she'd known for a while that Dad sometimes did things he shouldn't, things that made her uncomfortable. I asked her if I only wanted to know the good stories or the full picture, and she said she'd never think less of me for asking. I said I wanted the truth, because I believed people could be complicated, good, bad, or both. I wasn't interested in hiding the ugly stuff, and I was relieved she finally trusted me enough to tell me. Still, I wasn't ready for what was coming next. Mom said that my conception wasn't exactly planned. Dad loved her and was happy, but when she told him she was pregnant, he took it hard. Though he was excited, he also felt like his life was about to change forever. She explained that he wasn't doing great at work, not getting promotions, and feeling frustrated about the future. Then, one day, he came home from a football match with a spring in his step. When she asked what he was up to, he waved her off, acting secretive and aloof. For weeks after, he acted like he was the smartest man in the world. But then, suddenly, that cheerful, confident version of him just vanished. Mom said he started acting like something terrible had happened, staring off into space, wide-eyed and scared, like he was following someone or something. When she asked him what was wrong, he'd just lie, saying everything was fine, but he stayed like that for nearly a week. Then, out of the blue, he said he was going to Spain with a friend for a week to unwind. She thought it made sense. I was stressed, overwhelmed, and needed a break. He flew out, stayed for a week, and when he didn't come back, she started worrying. She contacted the police, told them where he'd gone, but they found no sign of him. They learned that he'd entered Spain on his passport, but there was no record of him leaving. They checked hospitals, jails, nothing. Weeks passed, and then she got the devastating news. A boat had washed ashore somewhere in southern Spain, and inside were the bodies of 2 men. Police told her they'd been shot at close range. Dad and his friend face down in a boat floating off the coast. The authorities weren't sure why Dad and his friend had been murdered. Evidence pointed to drug trafficking, with evidence of cocaine residue in abandoned luggage. That was shocking because Dad was never involved in drugs, and now it looked like his big money-making scheme had gone terribly wrong. And it got even worse. About a week later, police raided our house with a warrant. They believed Dad had committed an earlier murder, and the stress was so overwhelming that Mom thought she might fall apart. Imagine knowing your whole world turning upside down. The police searching every corner of your house, digging into every secret. When they finally told her what was really going on, it was worse than she'd ever dreamed. While she was pregnant with me, Dad had worked himself into a frenzy trying to make extra money. He'd been exploring all kinds of illegal schemes. One of his contacts was a guy named Mustafa, an old Turkish man who owned a kebab shop in their neighborhood. Dad would visit him often after football games. Mustafa had ties to the Turkish mafia, who smuggled illegal goods into the UK. Dad was talking about turning 10 grand into 250,000 pound spears, parties, big spending. He'd texted a buddy about it, asking if he had 5 grand to invest, and they'd planned to do it together. But the police found the messages, and when the shipment that Dad invested in got seized, it was the last straw. They claimed the cargo was confiscated, yet Dad and his friend didn't believe it. They thought Mustafa had robbed them. Dad's obsession turned dark when he hired some thugs to intimidate Mustafa's brutal, malicious plan involving kidnapping, torture, and violence. They caught Mustafa, beat him up, burned him with cigarettes, and demanded his bank details. But he refused to confess to swindling them. They think Mustafa died during those terrible acts and that Dad was forced to hide his body. Because if he'd taken the money out of Mustafa's account, it would have led right to him. From there, they hatched a reckless plan to smuggle drugs through Europe. Dad and his friend thought they could bypass airport security by avoiding flights and instead buy cocaine from maritime smugglers in Spain, then travel across the continent by train. But something went wrong. When Dad and his buddy bought from some shady guys at sea, they either got double-crossed or had their stash stolen. The empty bags with residue suggest they were intercepted, possibly by someone in the Strait of Gibraltar, maybe Turkish smugglers their father had pissed off. The police later confirmed a drug seizure at Falmouth Harbor, which proved Mustafa's claims weren't lies. Dad's plan was a disaster. And the biggest shock, about a week afterward, police got a warrant to search our house. They believed Dad was involved in a prior murder, possibly connected to his own death. The investigation was overwhelming. Mom felt like she might lose her mind, so much fear, so many questions, and nowhere to turn. As all this was happening, Dad was desperate to protect us. He'd been pushing himself to find other ways to make illegal stuff, mostly, and eventually, he met Mustafa's cousin, Muzzy, a guy deep in Turkish circles. Dad thought he could make a quick buck turning 20 grand into 250,000 again. Muzzy promised him he could do it if he handed over 10 grand in cash. They planned another smuggling run, bigger this time. But luck wasn't on their side. The shipment was seized, the money gone, and they believed Mustafa had robbed them after all. In their rage, Dad and his friend decided to kidnap Mustafa and torture him to find out what went wrong. But it was a brutal, reckless plan. They shackled him, set him on fire, and demanded answers. Yet he refused to confess, giving them his bank details instead. No one knows exactly what happened after that. Some say Mustafa died in the torture. Others think Dad killed him, staged the body, and obliterated evidence. For all we know, Mustafa's body was dumped somewhere at sea, his killers never caught. Soon after, Dad and his friend decided to escape. They dashed for Spain again, planning to avoid airport security altogether, thinking they could buy more drugs and then take a train across the continent. But on their return, they either got double-crossed at sea or lost their stash entirely. The abandoned bags with residue suggest their operation had been compromised. Someone, maybe Turkish smugglers, perhaps rival criminals, had intercepted them. And that's when I finally figured out the truth. Thinking about Uncle Jack's story about those cabins, the seizures, the murders, the all connected. My father's reckless, dangerous schemes had spiraled way out of control, and he'd paid the price. I wrestled with that reality for a long time afterward, the fact that Uncle Jack was likely involved in all the chaos. I don't hate my dad. I love him. I know he did all that out of love for Mom and me, but I also wish he'd stuck to safer, legal pursuits. Because if he had, I might have had a different father. Ran that thought hurts more than anything. In the end, the police caught him, and he was sentenced to life. He's now in a regular prison, and they say he no longer poses the threat he once did. But can anyone really erase the darkness that shaped him? Or are people like Joseph Fritzl always doomed to be threats to those around them, vulnerable or not? Thanks for listening. If you've got a story you want me to tell, send it over at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com. Remember, Jim Chuck doesn't tuck.